building department. We also have County and Humboldt and technical problems. And David Acevedo and Kelsey Bennett, who's with Rincon Consulting, who's worked on the DEIR reports. I would like to just start off by saying tonight what we're going to try to do is give a presentation on the DEIR, on process, and what's included in it, and then really take your comments. So it won't be a debate or anything tonight, but we'll try to take your comments, and if you have things that are questions about process and things like that, we're happy to answer those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey and let her get started.
Great, thanks, John. Can everyone hear me on the mic? Okay. Okay. Just wondering if I could leave it down and talk. And can everyone online here? Should we do a test for somebody online to check that they can hear online with everything? You can hear it on your, okay, perfect. All right, good evening. Nice day outside, I think. So my name is Kelsey Bennett, Director of Environmental Sustainability Planning with Rincon Consultants, and assisted the county with preparing the draft EIR for what is the Regional Climate Action Plan and the CEQA GHG thresholds, which are significance thresholds for use for CEQA analysis in general. Real quick, the agenda for this evening, going to go over the meeting purpose real quick, context and approach of the EIR, quick summary of results, and mitigation measures to the best of my ability. It's always a challenge to distill an almost 1,000-page document down into a brief hearing presentation, but I'll do my best for you all tonight. And also a quick discussion about the alternatives that were analyzed in the EIR, and finally some of the next EIR steps, and finally the most important part of tonight, which is to take your public comments on the draft EIR itself. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is the official forum, public forum, to collect verbal comments on the draft EIR. You also have the opportunity to provide written comments through April 5th, which is the close of the public review and comment period on the draft EIR. And these verbal comments received this evening, plus all those written comments in combination, will be considered for what will be the final EIR. And if I haven't defined it yet, EIR stands for Environmental Impact Report. And then also the CEQA, which stands for the California Environmental Quality Act, which is the California state environmental law against which you have to prepare environmental review documents for any proposed project or plan. That regulatory purpose of an EIR is to disclose potentially significant environmental impacts of a proposed plan or project, to identify ways to avoid or reduce potential environmental impacts, and to consider potential feasible alternatives, and of course, the most important thing, involve the public participation in this overall environmental planning process.
Sorry, we're sharing with the folks at home, and it's not changing the screen.
Is it your screen? Let's do that. Here we go. Perfect.
Back to the PowerPoint. Is it sharing okay now? Okay, perfect. It's not letting me advance the slide. Ah, perfect. Okay. Great. Okay. So under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, to do an environmental impact report, you have to have a quote unquote project under CEQA. And in this case, the project that this EIR analyzes is the Regional Climate Action Plan itself and the CEQA GHG thresholds. Should be noted that the CEQA GHG thresholds, because they are technically threshold metrics, while discussed in the EIR, they weren't as much as the focus, because the Regional Climate Action Plan itself is the actual part of the project that could result and potentially physical environmental impacts. And so therefore was more of the focus of the EIR in general. The lead agency is obviously the Humboldt County, but also the 7 incorporated cities will also consider adoption of the project, the cap and the thresholds as well themselves. And then the type of EIR that was prepared is a programmatic EIR. So that is a more comprehensive evaluation for longer term plans such as this. It's very regionally diverse because it covers the county and all 7 cities here. And also it's a longer range plan. It actually goes through 2045. And then, so the EIR itself screens which of those climate action plan measures and actions could potentially result in environmental impacts. It focuses on reasonably foreseeable physical environmental impacts that could result from implementation of the cap on the ground. But since no specific projects are yet proposed, the analysis is not parcel or project specific. Anybody who's familiar with a general plan, for example, for a city or a county, it's kind of similar to the CEQA that's done programmatically for that kind of a longer range plan. And many future development infrastructure type projects will require additional project level environmental review once those project details were to be known and locations were to be known. And finally, alternatives were also evaluated and considered in the EIR. And just for those of you, especially probably at home, who can see this, anyone here in the room, we can provide this later. It's hard to see on the screen, but that link at the bottom, if you haven't found it yet, is where you can read the draft EIR 1. So EIR, the use and the purpose. So the EIR itself serves as that CEQA environmental review officially for the cap and the thresholds. It's required for eventual consideration by the Board of Supervisors for adoption of the plan and the thresholds. And it determines a relationship to future cap projects as well. Now, the separate CEQA GHG checklist and thresholds are 2 separate things. Just want to go through a high level what the use and purpose of those 2 separate entities are as well. So the GHG checklist is an internal tool for the county and city planners to use when they would go to conduct a qualitative analysis of CEQA GHG emissions impacts for any projects proposed across the county and the cities for future projects, not just cap specific projects, any projects. That's why it's a general CEQA GHG checklist and not just for cap projects. It's basically a cap consistency checklist that can be used for that qualitative GHG CEQA analysis for future projects. And it typically consists of a list of questions that the planners use for determining consistency of a proposed project or plan in the future, and thus what the extent of a plan or project's contribution is in general to climate change. Now that's a qualitative approach. If potentially a proposed future project's plan, potential future project or plan for some reason doesn't show consistency with all the questions of essentially the CAP CEQA checklist, then a quantitative analysis related to CEQA GHG emissions would need to be prepared. Or if it's more of a complicated project or for a various variety of reasons that the county or city, depending who the lead agency is for that project or plan, determines is just a necessary additional analysis level to be done at the quantitative level. So what these thresholds are is they're metrics, they're quantitative metrics that against which modeled or quantified GHG emissions would be compared to determine CEQA significance for future projects. All right, so then comes the challenge of summarizing the EIR itself. So, all right, for the color key, for those of you who can see the screen, things indicated in red are the environmental topics for which significant unavoidable impacts, even with proposed mitigation, incorporated were determined. And so what this is actually a conservative analysis because again, it's programmatic and it thinks about anything and everything that could be a CAP project that could be implemented physically out there across the county and the cities. And if it were, could it have a physical environmental impact? And if it could, what kind of mitigation measures, should be considered as a baseline to move forward with? But that can be in the future refined and expanded upon as needed at the project level. So I'm going to go through these topics that are highlighted in red in more specifics here. Okay, so for aesthetics, so operational impacts related to, and these are all very specific CEQA topics. So if you want to get more details about what these are defined as, feel free in the EIR to get into those. But related to scenic vistas, they have specific definitions, scenic resources within a state scenic highway, and visual character and quality. So this is the potential for maybe potential future larger scale renewable energy, fuel, or organic waste processing facility projects to maybe have an aesthetic impact. But because again, it's not known where they'd be located or what their physical details and framework would be at this point in time, we conservatively can assume potentially significant avoidable impact. Same for air quality. Again, you don't know the extent of future projects, the construction impacts related to criteria air pollutants from the temporary construction activities. Just a reminder, criteria air pollutants are the ones that cause the smog regionally versus toxic air contaminants, which were also discussed in the EIR, but determined to not be significant and avoidable, are the ones that are more, unfortunately, the cancer-causing type of pollutants. For biological, there was a section that we combined called bio, ag, and forestry resources in the EIR, and operational and construction impacts related to special status species, wildlife movement corridors, and agricultural resources, specifically the potential conversion of farmland to non-agricultural uses. Again, because we don't know where projects will always be, we determined potentially significant unavoidable. Cultural and tribal cultural resources. So specifically construction impacts related to historic resources. So historic resources, as a reminder, are generally resources like buildings, what we call above ground cultural resources, versus archaeological ones are typically what we call below ground cultural resources. And so the potential, again, is if there would be a project in the future that would renovate a site that had older buildings on it, then maybe could be considered historic at some point, then that could be a potentially significant impact and would have to be analyzed at that project level at that time. So for noise, impacts related to noise, again, from construction and operational, stationary, and transportation noise, because again, you don't know. And utilities and service systems. Construction impacts specifically related to water, wastewater, and electric power due to those potential future infrastructure facilities, and also operational impacts for electric power due to the potential future infrastructure facilities operations themselves. So what are the mitigation measures for that list of significant avoidable impacts that were identified? So to start with aesthetics. For those scenic vistas, scenic resources in a state, scenic highway, and visual character and quality impacts, the following mitigation measures related to alternative design measures and implementation of visual screening. Alternative design measures are more for the operational side of things. Visual screening can either be construction temporary related or operational related. Now, for aesthetics, there was also some impacts that we determined would be less than significant with mitigation and not significant unavoidable, because we believe that there would be light and glare reduction design measures that one could identify at the project level in the future to mitigate those impacts. Okay, air quality. So with those criteria pollutant impacts during construction activities, specifically things like the kicking up of dust, fugitive dust control measures that would be required, and also back to what I was mentioning about criteria and toxic air contaminants, diesel equipment emission standards would be implemented, whether it's at the type of construction equipment level that will be used and a certain amount of filters on them, or the actual distance of construction to potentially sensitive receptors. So those toxic air contaminants, the reason that we determine less significant with mitigation is because you can do this thing called a project level construction health risk assessment when a project's identified in the future. And those always come with final recommendations of what to do during construction and potentially operation long-term to minimize what is that potential cancer risk related to toxic air contaminants to folks, sensitive receptors in the future. All right, so the biological resources section. For special status species and wildlife movement corridors, again, we were being very conservative. We don't know where the projects will be. So we wanted to be conservative and say that projects in the future would have to conduct a project level biological resource assessment. That's where you assess the habitat, the potential species in that specific area that would need to be mitigated potentially if impacts were to be identified. Conducting pre-construction bird surveys and implementing those minimization and avoidance measures. And same thing for roosting bats. Similar to the bird surveys, you do those pre-construction surveys to make sure you're not affecting nests and habitat to the extent possible with the construction activities. And then again, maybe if something is developed off the coastline, a marine mammal monitoring plan and again, implementation of avoidance and minimization measures would be required to be identified and implemented at that time. And finally, wildlife corridor measures would need to be implemented into the design. I don't know if you guys have ever seen any of these. They could be quite cool, whether it's a roadway that was happening and then you leave underpassage for animals to still get through, or sometimes I've seen overpassages as well, related to maybe a facility, and also not wanting to cut off wildlife movement in general in the county. And then finally, potential impacts related to sensitive communities like wetlands would be reduced with implementation of the measures that we identified specific to, again, the aquatic environmental design implementation measures. And basically the compensation, there's mitigation banks out there for sensitive habitat like wetlands, where you can develop in one area, but then you're enhancing and preserving another area. Kind of like when trees are taken out, but they can be replaced as well. So for agricultural resources, again, significant avoidable, even with the potential impacts we identified at the programmatic level. Future projects will get into the specific level, but it's basically to try to, the recommendations of this mitigation were to try to avoid actively farmed lands, prepare and implement an agricultural management plan, and prepare and implement a decommissioning soil reclamation plan. These are all things, again, that would be necessary if a future project identified that something would be on land categorized as official farmland or prime farmland, but would propose converting it to non-agricultural resource uses. So for that historic resources impact, a little to add on to more what I said earlier, the issue is that with a longer term plan that will be implemented over the next 20 or so years, the definition of historic resources is partially related to the age of the resource. So something might be only 35 years old right now and not considered a potentially historic resource, but if a CAP project were to be proposed 10 plus years down the line, and that's a potential resource, it would have to be analyzed to be determined whether or not it was a resource or not. Because at that point, it's 45 years or older, and the State Historic Preservation Office says that thou shalt study and see if that's a potential eligible historic resource or not. So that's why, again, without knowing the timing and the location of things, we consider it a significant and unavoidable impact. So part of that would be what I mentioned. The mitigation is prepare that historic resources evaluation at that time for if something at that proposal stage would be 45 years or older in terms of a structure or a building where redevelopment or renovation would occur. For the archaeological and tribal cultural resources, which I mentioned is a little bit more of the below ground cultural resources, that would be mitigated with the preparation of archaeological resources assessment prior to any kind of project approval in the future. And then in addition to this, when it comes to tribal cultural resources, and quite frankly, paleontological resources too, that's going to be your potential dinosaur and mammoth type stuff underground during construction. If anything were to be identified by construction workers, they would stop work for this mitigation and bring out the experts to make sure that everything's identified and an appropriate plan moving forward before the continued construction would occur. So for noise, there's lots of different things you can do with noise to keep it high level for now. I'll just get to the fact that there are noise reduction measures at both the construction and the operational level that can be studied and identified at the project level for future CAP projects. And then also ground-borne vibration can be reduced less significant with the implementation of a construction vibration plan for future projects. And then finally, for utilities and service systems, the reason we consider that a significant unavoidable impact was because it's the construction, it's construction impacts related to the physical, it's impacts related to the physical construction of any utilities. And obviously the CAP allows for the potential for renewable energy facilities and composting facilities in the future to be built. And therefore, by definition, all the other impact topics I mentioned that had construction impacts and had mitigation, but were significant and unavoidable, by default get connected to this utilities impact as well, because the project by default encompasses the potential for utilities construction and implementation. All right. So the EIR alternatives that were analyzed for no project that's required again by the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines that a no project alternative be analyzed. What the EIR that's identified in the EIR as a sustainable communities alternative. This would accelerate and increase VMT reductions in the county, and this alternative shifts the focus a little bit more to integrating transportation planning with land use planning to achieve a even further reduced regional VMT past what the CAP itself would achieve. In addition, all the remainder of the CAP measures would, for all the other sectors, energy, water, waste, would also be implemented. And then the third alternative that was analyzed in the EIR was what was called a carbon sequestration alternative. And so for this alternative, basically it would expedite the initial carbon sequestration analysis and require the county to develop and adopt policies to manage the Humboldt's carbon stock such that the carbon sequestration occurring in the region would be tracked and incorporated into the CAP's GHG emissions inventory and ongoing tracking. So basically, this would accelerate the timeline for initiating also industrial carbon sequestration projects, as well as taking credit for and inventorying the natural carbon sequestration that is the biomass in general across the county. So this is also an alternative where all the other sectors, energy, et cetera, measures from the CAP itself would also be implemented. And just a quick high level of what the EIR findings are. So we're required under CEQA to say which one is the environmentally superior alternative. And that's based on the level of the number of impact categories that occur in the EIR, as well as the intensity or context of those impacts as well across those topics. So overall, it was found that alternative 3, that carbon sequestration alternative that I just described, would be this environmentally superior alternative, and that's because it would further reduce impacts related to bio, ag, and forestry resources by utilizing and preserving a little bit more of the biomass out there to make sure it's not being used for the projects themselves, and again, taking account for it in that carbon sequestration and GHG emissions inventory. And quite frankly, just advancing the climate action plan goals to a greater extent and an accelerated level than the general climate action plan has proposed itself. So I'm going to end with the next EIR steps before we start taking public comment on the draft EIR. So if you can see on this slide and this timeline, where we started off with this EIR process with a notice of preparation and circulating that for 30 days for EIR scoping comments and input from the public. And that occurred generally in the month of September 2024 with an EIR public scoping meeting that was held on September 17th. And so that was the first opportunity for public input on this EIR. Then our environmental planning experts worked on the draft EIR itself over several months through the middle of February. And a notice of availability of a draft EIR was released in mid-February, which provided a 45-day public review and comment period on the draft EIR. And this is the star on the screen, right, is where we are right now in this draft EIR process and this public input opportunity. Once this public comment period is closed, the county will take into account comments received and prepare the final EIR, including responses to comments. And then finally, a final EIR will be released, likely right now it's anticipated for early summer 2025 with county planning commission and board of supervisors meetings regarding the final documents, the cap, the thresholds, the EIR currently estimated for sometime in summer 2025. Just a reminder that you can submit written comments via email to this email on the screen, seek responses at co.humboldt.ca.us, or via mail to this mailing address on the screen. And I'm going to go back to that slide just in case anybody wants to write down that address and wants reference to it. But I just wanted to end with this final slide, which will now be the official start of taking your verbal public comments on the draft EIR. So I'm going to go back to this again, just for people to have reference to how to submit comments via email and public and hard mail. And at this point, I think our best bet is we're going to have people raise their hands, and then we will bring a mic to you for you to say your name, if you're a resident of the county or a city or not, and what your comment is. I think we're generally trying to keep it to about 3 minutes per person, just to give everybody the opportunity, both here in person and online, to provide comments. But I don't want that to deter you if you had even more comments, because again, you can provide additional comments in a written format through April 5th. So with that, feel free to raise your hand if you would like to provide some verbal comments on the draft EIR.
You have it.
Okay, let's go to online then.
So
Julie, I see your hand is up. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Julie, are you hearing me?
Thank you. I had to wait for the unmute option. Is everybody able to hear me decent?
Maybe hold the mic up, James? Would that work?
I'll do another tester. I'm really just promoting everybody to write in. Thank you for giving the deadline in April and the information to do such. I really hope this recording is also, or this meeting's being recorded. I mean, you guys are trying to cover over 600 or 720 something pages of documentation in a half an hour PowerPoint. I'm a generational farmer here. My kids make 5 generations and been very concerned with the climate action plan and its ignorance of sustainability here in Humboldt. Also, we should qualify as being exempt. We are more than fulfilling our needs to remit carbon with our forestry. And I think it's really unfortunate that we're putting these caps on everybody that's already struggling and having issues. There's a lot of depth in this that was not covered. So I do hope that you could put out a liaison that people can contact, because 700 pages cannot be covered in a half hour and accepted, in my opinion. We need to work on our power grid, you guys. Imagine 2 weeks without power. Imagine a 64 flood again. We have bigger things on our plate that we should be preparing for. And I think that we are misguided with going down this path, like many others, when we should be focusing on what we need to actually sustain in this county and survive in a disaster. So those are my comments for now, and I do support everybody writing in, and please try and get this recording out if it was done. Thank you.
So just so everyone's people hear that comment, but did you guys capture it? And technically, this is being recorded, right? Is it
Yes.
going to be publicly available? So, okay.
We can, yeah.
So if you want to go back and listen to other people's comments, I will say that the part I did hear was that they were just basically, this person was encouraging everyone to submit comments as well. That's the main part I heard. So did you want to do it here? We have in person. Oh, no.
They could put the microphone upside down because of the way the speaker works.
Think that'll be better.
Thank you.
We're all a collective IT person.
I have run columnist with the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, and we're going to be sending detailed written comments, but I want to just make a couple of broad comments and then a question. So to start, I just want to point out that the vast majority of emissions in the county come from on-road transportation, but review of the DEIR leads to the conclusion that most of the identified significant impacts come from measures not related to transportation. And so just I think to keep in mind, most of the transportation related measures relating to reducing efficiency and electrification are not reducing the identified significant impacts. And in fact, the alternative 2, I think, which is the kind of doubling down on transportation emissions, demonstrates that there's more that can be done there while reducing impacts and reducing greenhouse gas emissions further. So that's something that we would strongly encourage. And then I think my question, I guess, is relating to the threshold setting. I did not see in the EIR any information about how the thresholds were derived, the assumptions that went into that. And I think that that's an important element to understanding what impacts they'll have, to know what assumptions and calculations went into deriving those particular quantitative thresholds, and how they stand up to the goals of reducing emissions for states' targets. Thanks.
Does the county have the thresholds document available online? Okay, so that might be something to consider.
Yeah.
So,
Anybody else?
So all the comments and questions will be responded to as part of the final EIR.
I have a couple of questions. First one is how's this gonna get paid for and implemented? The county's broke, state's broke, you're not gonna get any help from the federal government. Does that tax burden come out to everybody in Humboldt County? Higher taxes, property, income, sales? And then the second question would be, if this isn't, the recording isn't released on this is truly the beginning of the public election process. Since we're having the technical difficulties, because we can't hear what other people are saying, nor I'm not sure if they can hear us. So does it start over again?
It doesn't, so generally, like I mentioned on this slide right here, the general public input process in the EIR started back in September. This is the midpoint, 45-day
This is the first one.
public
No.
comment on the draft EIR. There was EIR scoping comments provided in September. Yep. So I don't know how to speak to the recording, the technical difficulties the county.
Yeah, so one of the things that the county is typically very clear on is that the meetings are the meetings themselves. And the hybrid is a courtesy. And so when things don't go well in a hybrid meeting, which this is, it just speaks to the importance of being here in person.
Did we capture the name? Okay. Anyone else online, maybe?
I don't see anybody with their hand up.
Oh, here we go.
Question. So just kind of leading through a few facts to the question. So just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, I kind of looked to Humboldt County's 1.5 million metric tons. And I see in Google search, so I'm not exact, but I found that the CAR website for the state of California shows that there's 371 million metric tons. So Humboldt County is about 0.4% of the state's contribution. On the national level, we produce about 6,343 million metric tons, being 0.02% here. And on the nation or the globe, about 51,200 million metric tons, which is 0.003% of the contribution. So Humboldt County really isn't the problem. And I think that we should consider carbon sinks with our forests in the area. We have, according to my research, 1.9 million acres of forest land in Humboldt County. And when I looked at that, the average would be something like 2 to 8 metric tons per year of carbon sequestering. So if I pick 3 metric tons per acre, we're talking about sequestering 5.7 million metric tons or 5.7 million metric tons versus Humboldt County's 1.5. So that means the county sink is almost 4 times greater than the actual footprint. And so in some way, we are already carbon neutral. And that, the history of Humboldt County is that we ship our logs out, we ship our water out. And currently, I'm aware that there are lots of carbon sequestering contracts going on throughout our forest lands for, to LA, across the nation, or abroad. And kind of my question is there a way that Humboldt County could be purchasing those credits and make it so that Humboldt County actually has a bank to help our community grow and strive towards a healthy community rather than creating sticks and penalizations for development? Instead, we could have a bank where we could just help a stronger local economy, and that we wouldn't give our resources away without some sort of local benefit. I know the context of the draft DEIR and other documents that I read indicate that, you know, we want to save that last sequestering the last 15% of California. But if we end up doing that in Humboldt County, it's probably giving that credit away to the rest of the state or the nation. It'd be really unwise to get that resource away. I know it's kind of a statement, but it's also a comment that how can we incorporate that into the cap where there was an opportunity for property owners, large timber holders, and even national forests and state parks to help put that forward. The number that I'm using at 3 tons per acre, you know, if you get to a redwood forest, an old growth redwood forest, that number is way higher. So my estimation is probably super low. So that's kind of my comment. I have a few others, but I always just take one at a time.
Did we get your name? Sorry.
My name is Raj.
Raj White. Okay, thank you.
Other question, I get a second shot at it.
Might as well keep going, Praj.
You know, there's this overall assumption that we're going to see our CEA do enough renewable power purchase contracts, and that PG&E is going to deliver us a grid and electric everywhere. With the assumption that by 2030 we can be a 100% renewable grid. What happens to the rules and policies if that doesn't happen? That's kind of my question. If we really can't get the grid and the renewable power in place, where does that leave the path, and how does that affect projects in the county? And then really the other piece I wanted to make a comment on overall, 2 comments. One, I really thought the Buckeye Conservancy comments that were included in the package really hit home to a lot of Humboldt County value comments. And then I wanted to add that, you know, given the information that the county has with sequestering, what is the cost of this plan? And does the draft DEIR properly address impacts on quality of life and sensitive economic conditions that exist in the county? And I know that you're taking on a big challenge by dealing with urban and rural areas, but I just kind of want to look at what are the impacts of this policy, especially if we don't get 100% renewable power throughout the county. What is the impact for the smaller communities, the less advantaged, and the economically difficult businesses, economically challenged business and residents? Right, that's my comments.
Thank you for your comments.
There, anybody online who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
We'd have to wait.
If you'd like to, go ahead and raise your hand. For those online to raise your hand, up at the top of your screen, there's a toolbar and there's a hand with a word raise right under it. Not seeing anybody else want to make a comment? Ask a question.
My name is Amy Downer. I echo what Brock had commented on, and then I also echo a little bit of what Colin commented. It'd be nice to know how those thresholds were derived. They're just thrown in there without any background information. Kind of have an idea of how they are based on other climate action plans that use similar characteristics. But the thresholds go to for projects in operation by 2030. What happens for projects that are beyond 2030? What happens if land use entitlement doesn't happen as in an expedited manner? It can be a very slow process. So limiting that to 2030, it's really would be beneficial to see what happens beyond 2030. Are we causing? So that's one. If you're above the threshold, is the county going to offer suggestions for potential mitigation measures? You mentioned mitigation banks for wetlands, very commonly used. You know, is there some bank or impact fee for exceeding thresholds so that then you can mitigate to less than significant impacts? I think that would be very beneficial for projects. I thought I had the third one. I think those were the two.
Let's see, under mitigation measures, and I know we're getting still kind of on the sequester. If a property were to go to a development for housing or something, and they kept us at a forest or some vegetation on site that it was going to sequester, would there be the ability to have mitigation for maintaining vegetation, forestry on site that could otherwise be logged or removed? And then I just, I'm a big supporter of rural Humboldt County, and I feel that in some of the kind of zoning or spot zoning changes that could happen, that I just want to state that it seems, I know that we're focused with the set of guidance for urban areas, but say the rural area like Petrolia could use an apartment complex. There's need for housing out there. And so it just as part of the creativity in climate action plan to encourage that maybe there's not a proper zone somewhere on Main Road to Petrolia, maybe there's not the perfect zone out by Wichita, but there could be the ability to rezone that for housing for some sort of service that would be needed. And there's probably a benefit, and those folks don't have to drive to town or travel. So just, I know that there is an element of land use of being creative. I just want to point out that maybe being able to upzone certain rural areas can actually have a positive net impact on greenhouse gases and allow people to stay within the community.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay. I see no hands up online, and I don't see anybody else trying to wrestle the mic out of Megan's hand. Raj might in a minute, but other than that, we're going to close the meeting. So I want to thank you all very much for coming, for giving your thoughtful comments, asking your thoughtful questions. These will help us to put together hopefully a more thoughtful final EIR that will enable the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors and then the cities to more accurately reflect on what it is that they're considering. So appreciate it.
And if you were able to sign in on the way in, please sign in on the way out. There's a sign-in sheet at the table in the back of the room. Thank you. Have a good evening.